Clay, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Appreciate y'all having me.
The reason I wanted to talk to you is in particular this is NBA China thing that's going on in the news. You've long kind of chronicled the intersection between the sports and politics. Why is it that this has hit a particular nerve across the country?
I think one reason is because of the hypocrisy of the NBA. I think a lot of people, if the NBA had just stuck to the idea of, we're going to shut up and dribble, we're in the business of selling basketball, we're not going to be focused on everything else external in the world of politics. Greg Popovich is not commenting on every single issue. Steve Kerr is not going to comment on every single issue. People out there who don't know, those are two NBA coaches. LeBron James, who certainly everybody knows, is not going to decide to weigh in on all these different political related issues. It was that this crucible moment where the NBA has pulled its All-Star game out of North Carolina over a transgender bathroom bill. They have removed the word owner because they decide it's racially insensitive, which I think is crazy for like 99.9% of Americans. And now, suddenly, they're confronted by China. And if you're going to make a big deal of the fact that your players, teams, and coaches are not going to go to the White House, how in the world are you going to acquiesce and effectively bend the knee to a communist dictatorship in China? And so I think it was the hypocrisy more so than anything else, because there are other companies that have done whatever they needed to make China happy. And I think a lot of people say, well, that's the downside of capitalism, but if you're trying to reach those 1.4 billion people, you have to play by Chinese rules in the Chinese country. But this felt different. I think it also, for a lot of people, felt as if China was moving from, hey, change this 2 minutes in your movie and we'll allow the movie to air in China, to we're expecting for Chinese values to be propagated outside of our territorial borders. And, oh, by the way, you don't have First Amendment rights to talk about China if you're Daryl Morey or your other NBA players.
Well, so that's the interesting thing here, right, is that we have this situation, and Shaq in particular has been the only high-profile person
his credit
within the NBA to speak out. And Charles Barkley actually attacked that position. Now, this is a man who attended, Doug Jones's political rally, and he's saying that you can't be political in your job. But that's just not really the case, is it?
Well, it's really funny, right? I mean, you can be political in some ways in your job, you can't others. And I think Charles Barkley would probably try to distinguish and say, that's Charles Barkley, the private citizen. We didn't have Doug Jones on inside the NBA and say, hey, everybody needs to go vote for this guy, which would be the next level. Or we didn't have this guy come out in an NBA arena. Obviously, Alabama doesn't have an NBA team, but if they introduced him at halftime of an Alabama football game and said, hey, I want everybody to go vote for the Democrat in the Senate election, I think a lot of people would say that would be inappropriate. But I think Barkley's wrong here, and I think Shaq is right. I mean, to me, Shaq deserves a lot of credit for speaking out in a way that might hurt his overall brand value in China. Ultimately, it's not even just basketball for LeBron, who said, I'm about more than an athlete. I won't shut up and dribble. He wants to make sure that Space Jam 2 gets on in Chinese theaters. And so, in addition to the fact that he wants to protect his brand for basketball, he also wants to protect his brand from an entertainment perspective.
So, Clay, lay this out for you. I mean, do these people think of themselves as Americans or no? That's the real question. Is the NBA an American league or is it a global league? And how do they think about themselves?
Well, and also not only how do they think about themselves, but does the NBA have a belief in an overall right government, right? And to me, that's what's so disappointing about the player, coach, and league response here is everybody wants to talk about whether they're on the right or wrong side of history. It's a big topic now. Anybody who studies history knows it might take 200 years to figure out what the right or wrong side of history on particular issues might be. But what I believe we know already as we're sitting here talking today is being in favor of democracy is on the right side of history. Being in favor of individual human rights is on the right side of history. And here the NBA chose to be on the wrong side of history. I said earlier, and I've continued to say, whether or not you favor democracy and human rights is akin to saying, do you believe somebody should have clean drinking water? Do you believe that kids should be able to go to school and become educated? These are nonpartisan, non-political issues to me that have a very straightforward and easy answer. And the NBA's inability to provide that clarion call of decency, I think, struck many as a totally discordant.
So here's the question. Are Americans actually going to abandon the NBA or the NFL over their political concerns, or does everybody just love sports? What do you think?
I think in general, not being political is the right direction for leagues to go. The NBA, after the Colin Kaepernick protests, lost almost 20% of its overall audience. and they've gradually come back since. But in the 2 years during and after Kaepernick, 20% of the audience disappeared. They've started to come back now, but that's a massive hit to the overall brand value. I believe the NBA, as they deal with this fallout from China, is not going to lose the hardcore NBA fan. If you love a team or you love a player, you're still going to support them. But when they get into the playoffs and the casual fan comes in, I don't watch a lot of regular season NBA basketball, particularly not when it's going on during college football and the NFL.
Right.
But I watch a lot in April, May, and June as their audiences grow. I think that's the guy and girl they lose with the way that they behaved in this fashion.
So final question for you, which is, what do we do about it, right? So like if a government person is looking at this, should they ban the NBA from going in China? Is that the right approach? We don't really know how to figure it out.
Yeah, I think for the NBA, what they should do is circle back around and say, we're not going to try to ban the word owner. We're not going to try to pay attention to individual state laws and make decisions that appeal to a small segment of the woke community. We're going to, frankly, shut up and dribble. If individual players and coaches want to have opinions, that's fine. But the league itself doesn't need to have an aggressive opinion. Because I think the posture on this story would have been totally different if the NBA had said, hey, we're a capitalistic organization. We're trying to make as much money as we can. That means in order to get our game into China, we have to make certain agreements with China. But I think the fact that you can unite AOC and Ted Cruz in condemnation of you, the only positive thing maybe we can say about the NBA overall is they so bungled this issue that they managed to create a bipartisan issue in a time of intense partisanship.
Well said. Well, Clay, thank you so much for joining me. Really appreciate it.
Appreciate y'all having me. Thanks a lot.